It was just past dusk, when the city's grime seemed to deepen, swallowing every flicker of streetlight. Broken bottles glinted on cracked pavement, and the echo of distant traffic felt miles away. In a narrow alley, squeezed between graffiti-scarred walls, a faint gasp cut through the stillness, a soft, desperate sound that snapped the night to attention. Footsteps approached tentatively, shuffling over discarded cardboard and damp debris. A low moan followed, as if someone begged for help, in a voice too weak to carry. Shadows danced just beyond sight, but the source of that plea was clear. A lone figure crumpled against the brick, every breath a struggle. No one would have guessed who was coming to her rescue. Not the suited strangers who hurried past without a glance. Not the patrol car idling at the corner, its officers engrossed in paperwork. Instead, a small silhouette emerged from the haze, thin frame wrapped in a threadbare jacket, knobby knees peeking out from patched jeans. 12 years old at most, and yet every ounce of fear was pushed aside by something stronger. The conviction that no one deserved to lie broken and forgotten. She pressed forward despite the pounding of her own heartbeat, her hand trembling as she reached out into the darkness. The alley's stench of refuse and rust faded around her, replaced by a single purpose: to save a life that others had already written off. No one expected help to come from the only person who had nothing to lose. And in that moment, everything changed. Amina woke before sunrise, long before the city stirred. In the single room she shared with her mother and 2 younger brothers, the thin mattress sagged under the weight of too many restless nights. A battered wooden dresser held their meager belongings, worn schoolbooks, a single change of clothes for each of them, and a faded photograph of their late father smiling against a brighter sky. By the time the first orange glow of dawn seeped through the cracked window, Amina was already kneading dough on a small oil-stained table. Flour dusted her dark braids, and the air smelled faintly of cinnamon and sugar. Before long she'd formed dozens of sweet buns, her mother's recipe, that she'd sell for pocket change at the corner market. Each loaf brought a few coins, enough to buy medicine for her infant sister, or to save toward a school uniform. After packing the snacks into neat bundles, Amina helped her brothers into threadbare jackets and coaxed them awake with soft whispers. They dressed quickly, chattering about playground games as she tied their laces and smoothed their hair. Their laughter, bright and unburdened, was a balm she carried with her, a reminder that childhood still flickered alive in spite of hardship. Stepping. Outside, she wove through narrow alleys lined with peeling paint and rusted gates. Vendors called out their wares, some greeting her with a nod, others ignoring the sight of a young girl pushing a cart heavier than she was. At the market, she arranged her cinnamon buns on a folding tray and greeted passing faces. Some customers paused to buy. Others turned away unsettled by the sight of her dark skin and thin frame. Yet each sale, no matter how small, filled her with quiet pride. By midday, Amina had delivered half her stock and run errands for neighbors who couldn't leave home, fetching water from the communal tap, carrying groceries up 3 flights of crumbling stairs, or reading letters for an elderly tenant whose eyes were dimmed by age. To them, she was more than a vendor. She was a lifeline in a neighborhood forgotten by the city's planners. When afternoon shadows lengthened, Amina returned home to help her mother with housework. She scrubbed floors until her knuckles ached, fetched wood for the stove, and kept a watchful eye on her brother's homework. Though her own schooling was intermittent, tuition fees often went unpaid, she devoured borrowed library books by candlelight, dreaming of becoming a teacher or a doctor one day. Her dreams felt distant as the city's towering skyline loomed beyond their rooftops, a glittering world that seemed to belong to everyone but people like her. Still, every evening she pressed her hands together in the cramped room and vowed to make a different life, for herself, her siblings, and the daughter her mother carried. In Amina's heart, the weight of poverty and prejudice was heavy, but so was her determination. She carried the hopes of her family on her small shoulders, moving through each day with courage that belied her age. And though the city often turned its back on girls like her, Amina knew one truth as plainly as the rising sun. Sometimes the smallest among us make the greatest difference. Amina pushed her cart through the crowded market, the scent of fried plantains and fresh produce swirling around her. A nearby stallholder set down a basket of mangoes with a grunt, eyes flicking past Amina as though she were invisible. She offered her cinnamon buns to a well-dressed customer in a crisp suit, his lips curled in polite disinterest before he turned away, not bothering to hide his judgment. At the schoolyard the next morning, boys snickered when Amina took her seat on the old wooden bench. "Didn't know crumbs came with you?" one taunted, dragging out the word as if it were dirt itself. The teacher glanced over, saw Amina's torn shoelace and walked on without a word. No reprimand, no offer to help. Amina simply tucked her chin, folded her hands in her lap, and stared at the dusty ground. Later, while fetching water from the communal tap, a city inspector in a spotless uniform passed without pausing, clipboard in hand. His gaze lingered only on graffiti-stained walls, not on the girl filling battered jugs. When Amina asked if she might sweep some paint chips for extra coins, he scoffed, "You'll never amount to anything in this part of town." But prejudice wasn't always so overt. At home, her mother cautioned her not to expect kindness from strangers, advice shaped by years of whispered insults and closed doors. Even neighbors would cross the street to avoid her, as if poverty were contagious. Yet Amina never let bitterness take root. That afternoon at the corner shop, a young clerk slid her change across the counter with such force the coins clattered onto the floor. He glanced at her dark skin, then his watch, then ignored her as he counted her few crumpled bills. Still, when an elderly customer struggled to reach a can on the top shelf, Amina stepped forward without hesitation, offering her hand, steadying his balance, and placing the can carefully in his basket. He smiled a genuine thank you, and for a moment Amina felt seen. These daily slights formed an unspoken lesson. The world might judge her by where she came from, but she would judge others by what they needed. Each microaggression and cold shoulder only hardened her resolve to act with compassion, believing firmly that empathy, not indifference, would break the cycles of bias she faced every day. Amina tightened the straps of her small satchel as she slipped out the back door, the night air cool against her skin. The moon was a sliver in the sky, barely lighting the narrow path that cut between rows of shuttered homes. Each step carried a weight of urgency. Her baby sister's fever had climbed again, and the clinic's pharmacy closed at dusk. Her heart pounded in her ears as she navigated familiar shortcuts, a rusted gate swinging on broken hinges, a toppled trash bin spilling, yesterday's refuse onto the pavement. The usual night sounds, distant car horns, the hum of a lone generator, felt muted, as though the city itself held its breath. Somewhere up ahead, a dog barked sharply, then fell silent. Amina paused under a flickering street lamp, the dim light casting grotesque shadows against the walls. She pulled her jacket tighter, hands trembling, and glanced down at the few coins in her palm. This was all she'd saved after weeks of selling buns and running errands. It had to be enough. She stepped forward, drawing in a steadying breath. The alley's entrance yawned before her like a dark mouth. Graffiti sprawled across brick, half-obscured warnings scrawled in hurried script. A gust of wind rattled a loose shutter, and she thought she heard something, perhaps the scrape of a shoe against concrete. For a moment, doubt flickered at the edge of her resolve. What if someone, anything, was waiting in that darkness? But then she remembered her sister's fragile cries earlier that evening and squared her shoulders. Carefully, she rounded the corner and plunged into the alley's depths. Every shadow seemed to shift at the edges of her vision, each heartbeat echoing loudly in the stillness. In that moment, Amina had no choice but to press on, unaware that around the next bend, a life far richer and more dangerous than her own would need saving. Amina's breath caught in her throat when she turned the final bend and saw him. Leaning against the damp brick wall, half collapsed into the shadows, was a man whose clothes spoke of wealth, a tailored blazer, pristine white shirt now torn, and stained polished shoes scuffed with dirt and flecks of crimson. His face was bruised, a purple swell across one cheek, a trickle of blood at the corner of his mouth, and his fingers twitched against the rough surface as if he fought to stay conscious. For a heartbeat, Amina stood frozen, the alleys stale, air thick with the coppery scent of blood and the sour tang of fear. Her satchel slipped from her shoulder and thudded to the ground. Every instinct screamed for her to run, to flee back to the safety of home and leave this broken stranger to his fate. The city had taught her that danger lurked around every corner, that reaching out could make you a target. But another voice, softer, steadier, rose in her mind. He's hurt. He needs help. She swallowed hard, her legs unsteady as she crouched beside him. He didn't stir at first, eyes fluttering beneath swollen lids, as if caught between worlds. In the dim light, she could see the fine sheen of sweat on his brow, the rise and fall of his chest more shallow than it should be. "Sir?" she whispered, voice barely audible above the distant rumble of traffic. "Can you hear me?" His head lolled, and he managed a faint moan. Amina's heart pounded against her ribs as adrenaline surged through her small frame. She dropped to one knee, reaching for the satchel at her feet. Fingers trembling, she unzipped it and pulled out the tiny first aid kit she kept for emergencies. A few antiseptic wipes, sterile gauze pads, a roll of medical tape, and a small bottle of water. Her hands shook as she dabbed at the blood matted in his hair, careful to avoid causing more pain. The wound above his temple was deep, enough to send a warm trickle down his face, and she pressed the gauze gently against it. He needs help fast, she thought, eyes scanning the alley's entrance. The street beyond lay empty. Not a soul. In sight. Even the stray cats that usually prowled this way had slipped away. A surge of fear flooded her. What if the people who hurt him are still out there? Her pulse raced, and she glanced toward the darker recesses of the alley, imagining shadowy figures creeping closer. Torn between panic and compassion, she closed her eyes for a moment, drawing strength from the memory of her sick sister's cries. "I can't leave him here to die," she reminded herself. Carefully, she slipped an arm under his shoulders and another beneath his knees. His weight surprised her, heavy and unyielding, and she gasped as she lifted, taking a steadying breath. She staggered slightly but refused to let go. With slow, deliberate steps, Amina began to carry him toward the street. Each footfall was an effort. Her muscles burned, her vision blurred at the edges. Yet she pressed on, focusing only on the rhythm of her own breathing and the fragile life she held. As she neared the alley's mouth, the city lights grew brighter, casting a halo of safety around them. A siren wailed in the distance, and for a moment, Amina allowed herself a flicker of hope. "I'm doing the right thing," she thought, determination settling in her chest. "No matter what happens next, I can't turn back now." And so, with every ounce of courage she possessed, Amina stepped into the glare of the streetlight, ready to face whatever came, driven by the one truth she'd always known. Compassion can overcome fear. Amina's fingers shook as she tore a strip from one of her cleanest scarves and pressed it against the man's temple wound. The fabric ballooned with bright red blood almost immediately, and she tore another piece to wrap tightly around his head, knotting it just above his ear. Her makeshift first aid kit, 2 scarves, a half-empty bottle of water, and the gauze and antiseptic she'd begged from the local clinic, was nothing like the sterile supplies real paramedics used, but it was all she had. Kneeling in the gutter, beside him, she poured the last drops of water onto a gauze pad and dabbed at the dried blood crusting his cheek. He hissed through clenched teeth, and she flinched, apologizing under her breath before pressing on. Each breath he drew was shallow, as if he were fighting to stay tethered to life. The cool night air felt suddenly too warm, stifling her with the urgency of every ticking second. "Help!" she cried, her voice cracking. She scrambled to her feet and waved her arms, her small frame silhouetted against the dim alley light. "Somebody, please!" But the street beyond remained silent. No headlights slowed, no figure emerged from the shadows. Even the stray cat that had ventured this way fled at her shouted plea. A cold knot formed in her stomach. She couldn't leave him here, but she also couldn't carry him forever. Every time she tried to lift him, a fresh wave of dizziness threatened to topple her. Still, she gritted her teeth and bent again, looping her arms under his shoulders and knees like she'd seen workers lift sacks of rice at the market. He sagged in her arms, but she pressed on, inching forward. Each step was agony. Her calves burned, her back protested, and the scarves cut into her palms where she gripped too hard. He murmured something she couldn't make out. Pain, thanks. Fear. And she repeated between breaths, hold on. Almost there. The glow of the main street's neon signs grew brighter, painting the alley walls in harsh red and blue streaks. She knew that once she reached the curb, she only had seconds to flag down help. Halfway there, his body went limp in her arms. Panic surged. She stumbled, nearly dropping him onto the graffiti-stained ground. His shallow chest barely rose. She tore open her satchel, fumbling for more gauze, but the wind had already carried away their antiseptic wipes. Tears blurred her vision. "Stay with me," she whispered fiercely, pressing her hand to his neck to find a pulse. Her fingers found a faint flutter, weak but there. Regaining her grip, she lifted him again, muscles screaming in protest. With every agonized step, she urged herself forward. For your sister, for his life. The glare of oncoming traffic at the alley mouth illuminated her path. A taxi rounded the corner, headlights washing over them. Amina waved frantically, her voice raw. "Please, help him!" The taxi screeched to a halt. The driver, a burly man with dark eyes, threw open his door. "Give him here," he said, lifting the billionaire's weight off her trembling arms. Relief broke through her exhaustion, but there was no time to rest. She nodded and pointed toward the hospital 2 blocks away. Inside the cab, every jolt of the road echoed like thunder in Amina's ears. She sat on the edge of the seat, heart hammering as the driver tapped his horn at stalled cars, weaving through traffic. The man on the stretcher lay pale and still, a single trail of drool at the corner of his mouth. Each blink of his eyelid kept hope alive. Minutes felt like hours. At one red light, Amina pressed her hand against the window, studying passing faces. Indifferent. Commuters, couples strolling arm in arm, a shopkeeper closing up for the night. None of them knew the drama unfolding in the back of that taxi. A fragile life balanced on the courage of a child. "Almost there," she murmured, though her voice was lost beneath the roar of the engine. Finally, neon hospital signs loomed. Overhead, the driver skidded to the curb and paramedics rushed out to meet them. Amina watched as they whisked him away on a gurney, disappearing through the sliding doors. She stood on the curb, shoulders heaving, chest tight with relief and dread. The taxi's door opened, and the driver offered her a hand. She shook her head, voice thick. "Thank you," she managed, though the words felt small against the enormity of what had just occurred. As he drove off, she sank to the pavement, the weight of the moment settling in. The night was still, but her world had shifted forever. She had faced fear, fought exhaustion, and she had saved a life. And in the echo of sirens fading into the distance, she understood that courage, no matter how young, could outshine even the darkest of alleys. Amina's lungs burned as she staggered into the pale glow of the main street, the weight of the injured man still heavy in her arms. The alley's darkness receded behind her, replaced by the buzz of neon signs and the distant hum of traffic. She dropped her free hand and waved it wildly. "Taxi, please help him," she cried, voice trembling but urgent. A battered yellow cab crested the block and slowed. Its driver, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, peered at Amina through the windshield. She could see his hesitation, first at the sight of a lone girl in the middle of the night, then at the blood-stained form in her arms. Fear coiled in her stomach, but she refused to let it show. Taking a trembling breath, she pressed forward. "Sir, I found him beaten in the alley. Please, I need to get him to a hospital." The driver's fingers drummed on the steering wheel. For a moment, nothing moved but the flickering street lamp overhead. Then he unlocked the passenger door with a resigned sigh. "Quickly," he said, voice rough but not unkind. Relief washed over Amina. Carefully, she lifted the man and eased him onto the back seat. As she stepped around to close the door, her gaze caught the tinted window's reflection. In the dim glass, she saw his face, still swollen, still streaked with blood, but beneath it all familiar features began to emerge. Her heart skipped. The man's high forehead, the shape of his nose, even the faint lines at the corner of his eyes. She knew that face. It was the billionaire philanthropist whose foundation had donated water wells to her community the year before, the same man whose portrait hung in the clinic's lobby. Recognition bloomed in her chest. The very person she'd once considered distant, untouchable, now lay helpless in her care. She swallowed hard and met the driver's gaze through the rearview mirror. He's important," she whispered. "Please, step on it." Without another word, the driver nodded and accelerated into the night, sirens guiding them on their way. As the city lights blurred past, Amina pressed her hand gently against the man's shoulder. His shallow breath steadied, and she felt a pulse of hope. In that moment, the alley's shadows felt miles away. She had bridged two worlds, one of privilege and one of struggle, with a single act of courage. And as the taxi carried them toward the hospital, Amina realized that sometimes it takes the smallest voice to echo the loudest. Amina watched from a shadowed corner as two paramedics wheeled the gurney through the emergency doors, their uniforms bright against the hospital's sterile lights. He was loaded inside with practiced efficiency, oxygen mask strapped, IV drip, already hooked to his arm, before the doors slid shut with a soft whoosh. She stayed back, heart pounding, as the nurses and doctors disappeared into the fluorescent corridors. A distant rumble grew louder until a news helicopter's blade thumped. Overhead, its spotlight swinging across the parking lot. A television mounted in the waiting area lobby flickered to life, and Amina glimpsed the headline, "Billionaire Tech Mogul Attacked Downtown," scrolled along the bottom of the screen in crisp white letters. The anchor's voice, urgent, measured, described a late-night assault, speculating about motives and promising updates as more details emerge. Her stomach lurched. Could it be him? The same man whose face she'd recognized in the taxi's reflection, whose foundation had drilled wells in her neighborhood, whose photo she'd studied on the clinic wall. She pressed her palm against the cool glass of the hospital entrance, replaying the moment she'd lifted his weight, the moment she'd wrapped her scarf around his wounds. He wasn't just a man in a fancy suit. He was one of the most influential figures in the city, a billionaire whose donations funded schools, whose investments shaped entire industries. Her mind spun with the implications. What would happen if word got out that a scrappy 12-year-old had saved his life? Still, amidst the shock, a quiet pride settled in her chest. She'd risked everything for someone she barely knew, and in doing so, had crossed a boundary that most would never cross. As the helicopter's light faded into the night, Amina slipped away, clutching her satchel. She walked home beneath the uncaring glare of street lamps, holding a secret more powerful than any riches, that compassion needs no wealth to change the world. Amina crept quietly down the gleaming hospital corridor, clutching the small paper bag that held her sister's precious medicine. The hallway lights hummed above her as night staff moved in hushed urgency between rooms. She paused outside the doctor-marked pediatric ward, her heart pounding as she gently pushed it open. Inside, her baby sister slept fitfully, cheeks flushed with fever. Amina knelt beside the narrow bed, carefully measuring out the drops into a spoon and coaxing her sister to swallow. Relief washed over her as the little girl's breathing eased, her tight grip on Amina's finger softening. Soft footsteps approached, and Amina looked up to see a figure emerge from the ward across the hall, the millionaire she had saved now. Dressed in a hospital gown and clutching an IV pole, walked unsteadily toward her. His eyes, once glazed with pain, were clear and focused. Before she could rise, he was at her side. He reached out and gently took her hand in his own, strong yet tender. The rhythmic beep of a nearby monitor punctuated the moment. Leaning close, he lowered his voice to a reverent whisper that only Amina could hear. "Thank you. You saved my life." Time seemed to slow. Amina's chest tightened as warmth spread through her limbs. Tears of relief and pride welled in her eyes, blurring the harsh overhead lights into soft halos. She opened her mouth to speak, but found no words that could match the weight of what she'd done. He squeezed her hand once more and released it, turning to head back toward his room. Amina watched him go, the paper bag still clutched in her other hand, and realized the true power of kindness. It reached beyond walls, beyond wealth or status, binding two strangers together in a moment of shared humanity. As the doors slid closed, Amina let her tears fall freely, tears not of fear or sadness, but of a quiet, unshakable hope. Amina barely registered the hospital doors sliding shut before the weight of everything she'd done washed over her. She stepped back into the corridor's dim light, her knees threatening to buckle. For a moment, she stood motionless, chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath, not from the run or the lifting, but from the rush of emotions flooding her heart. Tears found their way down her cheeks, hot and unbidden. They were not tears of sorrow, but of something far sweeter, relief that he lived, pride in her own courage, and wonder at the unexpected bond she'd forged with a man whose world seemed galaxies apart from hers. Each drop felt like a promise, proof that her actions mattered, regardless of the scorn or doubt she'd faced every other day of her life. She brushed a trembling hand across her face, wiping at the tears, yet they kept coming, reflections of a truth that finally landed in her mind. No more would she see her ragged clothes or her dusty shoes as signs of worthlessness. In that moment, Amina saw herself as she truly was, brave, compassionate, and capable of changing a life with nothing more than her two small hands and an unshakable will. In that moment, she realized her worth wasn't defined by her circumstances. The words echoed in her mind, weaving through the recent horrors of prejudice. Every sneer at the market stall, every teacher's indifferent glance, every passer-by who crossed the street to avoid her. Those slights, once so heavy, now felt like shadows dispelled by her own light. A single act of courage had broken through barriers built by fear and ignorance. She glanced down the empty hallway where the hush of the late shift mingled with the thrum of distant machinery. Somewhere beyond those doors lay a man forever indebted to a 12-year-old girl whose life he'd once overlooked. And somewhere beyond this night lay a world that might look at Amina differently now. One small hero among many, proving that valor and empathy know no age, no race, no economic boundary. As she turned to leave, the echoes of that voiceover carried her forward, a reminder that sometimes changing the world starts with answering a quiet cry for help, no matter who you are or what you have. Days later, a sleek black SUV rolled slowly down the narrow street, where corrugated tin roofs and peeling paint were the norm. Word had spread quickly through the neighborhood. The man, the billionaire tech magnate, was coming back. Clutching a bouquet of bright lilies, he stepped out onto cracked pavement as children paused their games and neighbors peered from doorways. Amina stood on her front stoop, her heart fluttering with a mix of excitement and nerves. Her mother emerged behind her, eyes wide with disbelief. The man approached with careful steps, lowering the flowers so as not to tower over the small girl. "Miss Amina," he began, voice warm but hushed against the hum of the afternoon. "I wanted to thank you properly." He handed her the lilies, and she accepted them with shy fingers. She watched him carefully as he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out an envelope. "I know money hasn't always meant much in this neighborhood," he said, offering a gentle smile, "but I hope this can help." Inside were documents for a full scholarship, covering tuition, books and uniforms, at the city's top school, along with a check to settle every medical bill from that night in the alley. Her mother stepped forward, tears glistening in her eyes. We don't know how to thank you," she stammered. The man shook his head. "No, thank you, truly. I've never faced fear like that, not until I felt the press of life slipping away. Your bravery teaches me more than my millions ever." "Good." He paused and motioned toward a boarded-up community center across the street. "I remember when I first came to this part of town, I saw potential in these streets. Today, I'm pledging funds to rebuild that center, a place for after-school programs, health clinics, even a small library. I want every child here to have the chance you fought for." Amina's eyes grew wide as she took in his words. The neighbors, once quick to dismiss her, now gathered in silent wonder, witnessing a promise that bridged two worlds. The billionaire stepped back, allowing space for hope to blossom on cracked concrete. As he climbed back into his SUV, he turned and offered one last nod. "Keep being you, Amina. The world needs your courage." She watched the vehicle disappear around the corner, clutching the lilies to her chest. In the warm glow of the afternoon sun, The battered buildings seemed a little brighter, and in her heart, Amina carried the certainty that compassion, seeded in the darkest alley, could grow into opportunities she had only dared to dream of. Amina sat at the small wooden desk in her one-room home, the late afternoon sun filtering through the cracked window, and dust motes dancing in its rays. Before her lay an open journal, its pages filled with spidery handwriting and doodles of hopes she hadn't dared speak aloud. Tonight's entry began with a single line. "Tonight I learned what true courage looks like." She paused, pen hovering, and reflected on the week's events. How many times had she been overlooked because of her age, her skin, or the threadbare clothes she wore? Yet here she was, the same girl who once felt invisible, now the catalyst for change in her entire community. She sighed, tracing the words. She'd written and adding another thought. When we truly see each other, walls of prejudice can crumble. Her mind replayed the moment the billionaire had knelt before her stoop, promising scholarships and funding for the very center that had once ignored her. In that instant, she'd witnessed how empathy could transcend fear, and how justice could follow as a natural consequence of understanding. The cracked pavement outside no longer seemed a symbol of neglect, but a testament to the resilience of those who walked on it. Fairness and justice prevail when we recognize each other's humanity. Amina wrote the line again in her journal, underlining it twice. It felt like a secret code she'd discovered, a simple truth that anyone, no matter their background, could live by. She closed the book gently and stood, moving to the small corner where her brothers played with worn wooden blocks. She ruffled their hair and watched their laughter ripple through the room, reminding her of why she'd chosen compassion over fear. Later, as the sky turned a deep indigo, Amina's mother called them to supper, stew and flatbread that tasted richer than any feast. They ate together by the single bulb overhead, sharing stories and laughter. Outside, life in the neighborhood carried on. Neighbors greeting one another, children chasing a ball on the cracked street, and the distant glow of the community center's sign beginning its long-awaited renovation. Amina leaned back against the wall, contentment settling in her chest. She had started the week as a quiet girl selling buns at the market. She would end it knowing that her small act of bravery had rippled outward, changing minds and opening doors. And as she drifted off to sleep that night, she dreamed not just of her own future, but of a world where every person's courage, no matter how small, could light the way to justice and empathy for all. If a 12-year-old with nothing but courage and compassion can save a life, imagine what you can do. Every small act of kindness has the power to break down prejudice and lift us all up. Subscribe to True Black Voices and tap the bell for more real stories of hope, resilience, and justice.